While the settings of most games are well established, there are a couple of games which are somewhat evasive in that regard. Stalker is a great example. The game got a flair and look which you could describe as post-apocalyptic, but that doesn't really match the actual scenario of this post-Chernobyl game. Encased, a pseudo-isometric RPG developed by Dark Crystal Games and published by Prime Matter, is pretty much sitting in the same boat as the Stalker series. But of course we will not just have a look at the setting of the game, but also at how the story is implemented, and we will check out how the mechanics work. But before we do that, we first got to have a quick look at the development history and where the game is coming from. Let's start! The Russian studio Dark Crystal Games announced the game in 2018, and just shortly after that they started a Kickstarter campaign for additional funding. They were already able to show quite a bit of the game, but wanted to collect additional money to make it bigger and more detailed. With 105,745 euros, they surpassed the goal of 86,000 euros, but it's not exactly tons of money for such a big project, which was supposed to be the fallout of our dreams.
Sort of the fallout of your dreams, which all of us could be proud of.
In 2019, the game was released as early access version, and in 2020 the publisher Koch Media joined in with its label Prime Matter and enabled the developers to also include additional localizations and to do more voiceovers, which however are only available in English and Russian. At the 7th of September 2021 the game had been fully released, though that doesn't mean that they also stopped development at that point. Since release, Dark Crystal Games released multiple patches which didn't just fix bugs and add quality of life features, but they also added additional content. I have been playing Encased since release up until the most recent content patch number 3. Which, among other things, added new events which you can encounter if you travel under the dome with your car.
All because of the dome. The dome.
Now, what is the dome? The answer to this question leads us to the quite interesting setting of the game. Encased is set in the 70s of an alternative past in which humankind discovered some weird dome-shaped energy fields just a few years ago. While humans and objects can travel inwards without issues, only objects can get out of it. And that also had a massive influence on history. Quite similarly as in Fallout, where nuclear energy massively boosted the technological development and where this could be found in cars and robots, in Encased, Relics had kind of that influence. Nobody knows where they come from or how exactly they are working, but even without knowing how they are functioning internally, you can still observe the effects on their surroundings and utilize that, which resulted in whole research teams being sent into the dome to search for relics, to analyze them and to bring them to the outside world. And with lots and lots of researchers, you also need to have infrastructure, technicians, managers, and lastly also henchmen, which mostly consist of former prisoners. Each of these groups, called wings, also got the designated color, so that you can directly identify a technician by seeing his or her blue uniform. And seeing orange, you know that this is a henchman and former prisoner. This international operation is led by a company called Kronos, and we are starting the game by being transferred down into the dome in order to begin our new job there. So at this point, you could still see it as some kind of science fiction Wild West pioneer story. Shortly after our arrival and having played a couple of hours, we will encounter an event which catapults us 2 years into the future, but which also kills all communication to the outside world. And without the communication and support from Kronos, being isolated from the outside, people have been forming different factions and are now fighting for survival. So, if you keep strict definitions, you might say that the game isn't post-apocalyptic, as you don't really know what happened in the outside world. But the setting definitely has a lot of things in common with a post-apocalyptic one. And in that regard, the game is very similar to the Stalker series, from which the developers might also have borrowed the idea of the anomalies, which you can find everywhere in Encased, and into which you should throw screws to deactivate them temporarily. How to deal with these anomalies and how to scan relics and other objects with our device, which reminds of the Pip-Boy, is something being taught to us shortly after our arrival in Concord Station, a Kronos base at the foot of the escalator we used to descend into the dome. This is also where we get a first impression about how the game is structured and which kind of freedom we have in our decisions. Of course, we can also meet plenty of habitants of the station, and in dialogues with them we can also see several dialogue options which are only available to us if we have the right character stats or we chose the right background at character creation. Personally, I created a character from the Silver department, a manager with some authority who can also use that to just ignore some of the rules in the beginning. There's also a reputation level with all the different colored wings, but in comparison that mechanic is almost irrelevant, and there aren't more than just a handful of events in the game where that reputation is being used. One of the features where the developers maybe originally had big plans, which gives the first impression of more complexity and depth than the game actually has. Of course, we are not limited to just having interactions with other Kronos members. We can also interact with plenty of objects in the game. Among these, the looting and examining of items, as we know it from other games, although in Encased, examining and looting trash cans and flower pots can easily get somewhat excessive. We can also pick locks or just bash them in. We can defuse traps and hack computers. The latter one is another of those things which, after some hours, gets a bit disappointing, as you will encounter plenty of computers which you will be able to hack, but where in about half of these cases a successful attempt is only rewarded by a note saying "System lockdown," as if you just lockpicked an empty chest. Of course, that is different at the very first computer we encounter. This terminal can be hacked to register ourselves this way, which will trigger a comment by the receptionist. By the way, after our registration, whether via the receptionist or the hack, we can also help out a colleague from the Silver Wing and register him on this computer as well. Alternatively, we could also register this guy as a mass murderer serving in the Orange Wing, which he won't be that happy about. Besides of all these decisions and actions we do within the normal game environment, often in the form of dialogues, there are also special events, which make the game switch into a special event view. In that view, text and options for decisions are displayed on the left side, and to the right side you often get some accompanying pictures of the scene. In addition, in some of these events you also got some sound effects, like in a radio play, so that the atmosphere is conveyed very well. Furthermore, some of these event texts as well as the main story dialogues are also voiced. The voice of the narrator is done by William Hope, an actual actor who is doing an excellent job, which in my eyes is one of the highlights of the game, similarly as the events as a whole, which you can see in a couple of games in Pillars of Eternity, but which are rarely used that frequently and are done as well as in Encased.
The truck skids, bypassing the turrets and sliding into the parking lot. Fortunately, this is outside the turret's firing range. Clara opens the door and falls out of the truck with a groan. You also climb out.
But while these events stay convincing and high quality until the end of the game, this cannot be said for all of the other content. While Encased is quite linear for the first 5 to 10 hours, it will open up after that, so that you can travel freely from zone to zone on the world map and decide yourself whether you want to follow the main quest or just drive around and explore new locations, which you can also find by just running or driving around. While a drop in quality within the main quest is also apparent, it's worse in side quests and side locations. There are several of these which you will complete and then think, and now? Was that it? Whether it's zones which you thoroughly explore but where you don't really find anything noteworthy, or side quests which just end like if they forgot to implement the last step of the quest with a highlight. Just a few short examples. In one of the cities you participate in an election and you can get elected as mayor yourself. While the whole election process is nicely done, the quest line just ends after the election. You are now mayor. Everyone goes home and everything is the same as before. And you, the player, are just left behind with your confusion. Another quest is about a cave with dangerous anomalies and some archaeologists which were supposed to study it. But in the end, these scientists decided to sacrifice themselves to close down the cave and entomb the danger with it. And by the way, doing so in an extremely silly way by splitting a key item into fragments and hiding them all around the cave.
Later.
But now you are going to help another scientist to break this seal and get back into the cave. So everything is being done, the cave is unlocked, time to go home, right? What about the danger you now released into the world? Well, apparently that's not our problem anymore. And like this, you will often experience situations where you find yourself as if you just discovered and dug up an old pirate chest, which you won't be able to open up because you get sent home before you got a chance to do so. Speaking of big treasures, unfortunately there's another issue in the game. As I mentioned, relics are the core of all the new technologies, and the game is also acting like relics would be especially valuable. But in terms of game mechanics, they couldn't be more obsolete. Usually relics have bonuses and maluses, which are both so tiny that the net positive is almost zero, which is completely buried also because of the bad balancing of the game. In the end, that means that all findings and rewards of this kind are quite disappointing. If you sum up all these aspects about the story, you get a rather mixed bag. I consider the setting and the overarching story as creative and overall quite good. There are these events outside of the 3D engine which are mostly well done and convincing. There are areas which are thoroughly designed and offer lots of options and interactions, but there are also zones which just feel dead. There's even a city where some fluff texts from NPCs and examining a couple of trash cans can already be considered as the highlights of the zone. Let's get to the mechanical part of the game, starting at the character creation. The character system consists of 3 components: attributes, skills, and traits. Attributes are being set at the beginning of the game, and they are fixed after that, and can only be modified by a point here and there by traits and skill unlocks. So you should already think about what you want to aim for at the very beginning of the game. But besides of some specific traits, you will rarely need extremely high attributes, and if you find yourself in a situation where an attribute needs to be 1 or 2 points higher for a specific action, you can usually buff these temporarily by 1 or 2 points by using some food or drugs. Attributes will also influence the skills, but only on a minimal level. However, you can also increase these on any level up, meaning that their initial distribution is far less important. While the exact level of the skill also has some consequences and can enable some additional dialogue options, the main focus is on unlocking additional abilities by reaching the 5 segments in each skill, which are staggered in 30-point steps, so that you unlock the last ability with 150 skill points. While the distribution on the first few level ups can certainly have some impact on what you can actually do and unlock with your skills, skills become almost irrelevant after about the first half of the game. And that is because of 2 reasons. The first one being that a skill of 90 or 100 points is basically enough to do almost everything with it. The second one being that you get so many skill points to distribute that at some point you just start to stuff them into some random skill which doesn't look completely useless. Lastly, you also got traits, though we need to differentiate between those at character creation and those which you can choose from at level up. The ones on character creation can have some decent impact on the game and often consist of bonuses and maluses at the same time. Regarding the traits on level ups, it's similar to the skills. While your choice does make a difference at the beginning of the game, later on you will wonder which is the least pointless one which is still left to pick. There is a trait called As a Bag of Hammers, which has a special status and comes automatically with an intelligence of 1, which, similarly as in Fallout, leads to completely different dialogue options. So that you cannot do any normal conversations, but like a madman just spontaneously start to sing or crawl around on the floor, which will also trigger according reactions with your conversation partners. A very cool feature, which must have cost the developers a fortune to implement.
Number 3, learn some magic tricks. Number 4, learn to use your weapon. Number 5, learn how to scan. With a scanner, see?
The administrator sighs heavily.
I hope that means yes. Welcome to Concord Station. Get going already. Go bug somebody else.
Another noteworthy trait is actually available at level up. While you can normally travel around the dome with up to 2 companions, who will also contribute in some dialogues and events, and who give some comments every now and then, you can also choose a trait which forces you to travel alone. In return, you get significantly more experience points. You should also be aware that all dialogues with or without companions have to be done with the main character, and you also can't increase any skills on your companions, so that the main focus is definitely on your main character. The game is also advertising its replayability, and due to the modular end sequence, like you might know from Fallout, there's certainly some appeal to go for some different choices. However, there are so many elements in the game which will be exactly the same on another playthrough and which are so time intensive that I personally don't see a lot of motivation there. With the one exception of playing with just 1 point in intelligence and the other one of just killing everyone. While these both are certainly some extreme playstyles, the game offers quite a lot of decision making to make a normal playthrough really custom and personalized to your own style.
Yep, you can travel the world, meet interesting people, and then kill them. And by that we mean everyone.
The same can be said about the settings in the option menus, which cover everything you could wish for. From detailed graphics options over settings whether or not you want unavailable dialogue options to show up, to settings regarding the scroll and saving behavior. Much less convincing is the interface in the game itself. Especially everything which is related to the inventory is rather badly implemented. Like finding special items on the world map, which are only displayed to you upon entering the next zone, or items you receive as quest rewards during dialogues, which you can't see at all and where you then need to check in your inventory to see what you actually got there. Though even there it's not directly apparent, as you first need to switch around the sort options, which again also don't work well, especially sorting for weight, which you need to do a lot when fighting against overencumbrance. At least there's a personal chest in which you can deposit any item, which is a blessing in any game with weight restrictions. Depositing and selling items is especially tedious though, as the inventory will always show all items, even those you got currently equipped, which makes it unnecessarily hard to keep an overview. Another example of a bad inventory interface is that you can split items in your inventory with a shift left click, but you can't do the same during trading and looting. There you need to use an unconventional double click. If you use that one in your inventory though, you won't split anything but use or eat the items. The weapon skills and stats are inconvenient as well. While you get displayed how much damage each skill and weapon does, you are not shown how many action points it's going to cost to attack. But without this info, knowing the damage is pointless as well. And to get this info, you actually need to equip the weapon and check the values on your action bar. In order to reload the weapon, you need to switch through all characters and weapons one by one and reload them individually, and also watch the animation to finish each time. Another thing which is unnecessarily annoying. By the way, there's also ammunition in the game, which you will find in huge amounts though, and which can also be crafted, so that it doesn't play a huge factor, which is the same with hunger, thirst or tiredness. The most relevant of these is probably tiredness, which requires you to either swig some coffees or to sleep a few hours in one of the beds, which you can find pretty much everywhere. At that point I also want to note that when sleeping you can also have nice and bad dreams, which will not just appear in form of a buff or debuff, but which also come with a very flowery description. These again are the little highlights of the game. One other thing which is not very intuitive is the stealth mechanic. If you are in stealth with at least one of your characters, you will see two circles around all NPCs, where the outer white circle has no relevance at all for sneaking, but just shows in which range the NPC would see you if you weren't sneaking. If you enter the red circle, however, then your stealth value will go down till 0, which will remove your stealth status. The shooting range of a sniper rifle is far higher than the outer circle though, in which you would also need to be in order to trigger enemy fire. So if you start shooting at an enemy at a long range, then the enemy will need to run towards you first in order to trigger the turn-based combat, meaning the enemy will already be severely injured or dead before he's close enough. And with that, I will also talk about the turn-based combat in the game, though I will keep it brief, not because the mechanics are so clear and easy to explain, but because combat doesn't play a big role for the majority of the game. At the very start of the game, when you don't have your two companions yet and neither a good weapon, then you might still encounter some fights which are rather complicated and challenging, and where you need to utilize everything available, from grenades over healing and a vanish ability. But once you are past the first about 10 to 20 hours in the game, there's hardly any battle on the highest difficulty, which is somehow demanding. You got a couple of different weapon abilities, but in most cases they just make no sense, so that you will usually just use the standard attack of one of your two equipped weapons. There are also enemies with certain resistances and immunities, and in theory you can check their stats, which is a bit tedious, but luckily the interface in combat is quite decent, and it also displays the actual damage you're going to do when you mouse over the enemy, which already includes the resistance calculation. It's just important in this case that your group is using a few different damage types, so that you don't encounter a fire necroid and all you got are weapons with fire damage.
Floor level -5. Living quarters.
And with that, we already had a good look at all the major aspects of the game, and you should have a good idea about what to find there. Well, at least I hope so. My conclusion, Encased is promising much more than it can keep over the duration of the game, which in my case, with reading out all the texts, was more than 120 hours. After 10 to 20 hours, you can already see a clear drop in how thoroughly things have been designed, which is especially true for some zones and game balance. The game is still fun, which is partially thanks to the great events, and partially because of the zones and quests which are actually designed thoroughly. But you have to accept that every now and then you will be disappointed, which of course wouldn't have happened if it was really the Fallout of our dreams. My personal rating of the game for that reason is a thumb barely reaching the 3/4 line. If you really like the setting and you want to sink yourself into the world, then you can definitely give it a try. But if you are rather skeptical or put a lot of emphasis on combat mechanics, then you should keep your distance, at least until new patches are being published, which hopefully fix the problems and fill the game with additional content. My journey under the dome finally comes to an end now. If you liked this review and it was of any help, then I'd appreciate a like. You can also consider subscribing to the channel in case you haven't done so yet. Every sub is going to help a lot and showing that I should keep doing these English versions of my reviews. If you want to go down memory lane, you can also have a look at the games I played at ndnw.net, where you will find brief descriptions and screenshots of all the games. Just be aware that most of the links there will lead to German videos. Goodbye for now, as I need to go back to reality for a bit. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.
You rip the glasses off your head. Then the lanterns all come on again, illuminating the stage where Santiago's standing, arms thrown up.
Thank you for coming, everyone. Maria and I will be waiting for you at our next sermon.